When I talk to data teams, data quality is still one of the biggest issues. It starts with the implementation of new events, that they are forgotten, implemented in the wrong way, are changed afterwards, and so a lot of things can go wrong. And one of the biggest problems afterwards is even when something goes wrong, it's super hard to clean it up. Because it's often like this, something that's already in the system, you don't really get out. And so we live with that for, I don't know, 10, 15 years. But there are definitely new ways that gives us more control about which kind of data quality we make accessible for everyone who's working with our product data. And in today's session, I want to show you how you can build a different kind of setup that can increase your data quality significantly and give you control about it to keep it that way. So let's dive into that. This video is sponsored by Mixpanel. Mixpanel has a new way to do product analytics with your warehouse data. You can connect Mixpanel to your data warehouse, and then you can run all the product analytics investigations and all the product analytics deep dives on top of your data warehouse data with clean, prepared, and high quality data. Check out the link in the description to learn more about the offering. I'm using it and I'm extremely happy to have this new kind of setup for product analytics because it unlocks so many more use cases on top of much better data than before. Let's really take some time to talk about data quality in product analytics. I want to explain a lot of things at the beginning to make it easy for you to really understand, okay, where the classic way to collect product analytics data has natural limitations. And then when I introduce the way that I often now use to get data into product analytics systems so that you can really understand what levels are changing by this new way and why it maybe really makes sense for you to make this investment as well. Because it's definitely a time investment with the way that I show you today, but I hope at the end, when you have watched everything, you understand when this time investment totally makes sense for you. So let's get into this. The classic way to get data into Mixpanel is using SDKs. And so just quickly recap what an SDK is. Let's say I have my application here. So let's assume it's a classic software as a service application. So it runs in the browser. So you come to the website, you click on login, you log yourself in, and then you do stuff. So it can be something like Miro, it can be Jira, Asana, whatever. And of course, we want to get the data, how people are using our product, into Mixpanel. So that we can analyze to see, okay, how features are performing and how adoption works and all the different things that we discuss on this channel all the time. And so the usual way to do this was to use an SDK. SDK means software development kit. In the end, some people just also call it tracking pixel. So in the end, like it's depending on which kind of platform you're doing it. Let's say, for example, if it's on web, it would be a JavaScript library. If it would be on the back end, it could be either, I don't know, Python, PHP, Node.js library that is sending these events from the back end into Mixpanel. If you run on any kind of mobile device, of course, then it's a Swift or Kotlin based SDK or whatever kind of language you use. But what does this SDK do in the end? Like the developers can use the SDK to tell within the application, track a specific kind of event. And so it's a line of code that a developer puts into the application. For example, when a user has signed in successfully, the server gives back his sign-in was successful. The developer can implement something that now, like a line of code is running, that sends the sign-up successful event to Mixpanel, and then Mixpanel receives it and puts it in their database so that in the end, like you can then run your kind of analysis in there. This is the way how we do analytics now for, let's say, 15 years, I would say. It's a very established technology. And this is the good thing. These tracking SDKs, they include things to ensure high data quality. What they're trying to do is to ensure the delivery of the events to Mixpanel. Because there are things that can go wrong from here to here. one of the problems is like the application runs in a web browser. The web browser is on your user's computer or iPad or whatever, and it runs in their browser. And there can be a lot of different kind of issues happening there that this kind of event never ends up on a Mixpanel server. And this can be like because the application loads too quickly between different kind of sequences, that before the event is sent, another process is happening, and so it gets blocked. Then it can happen that specific things in the browser can block it. This can be obvious things like ad blockers, but it can be also like other processes that run in the browser. And since we don't really control the browser, so it's not in our hand what runs there, we cannot really, so we have limitations to make sure that this data arrives. These are the system kind of problems that we can have. And so the SDKs try to work around as much as possible. And so they have specific things like their batch events, so that they're not immediately sent into the server. They collect, I don't know, 10 or 20 and then try to resend it, send it down, and once just check if it's really, if it was successful. If not, they resend it again. So also they try to do deduplication so that you don't send the same event 2 times. They take a lot of control as much as possible within the browser. But again, it's limited. The other problem that can happen, this is the thing that you might maybe all now roll your eyes, is of course, it's a human problem. And I would say like the most data quality problems happen because like we are involved in there. So if the machines would take over, which we all of course don't hope, then maybe we don't have tracking problems anymore. But okay, so what are the usual problems? The problems are like, for example, it's like a very obvious problem is that there's something implemented. So you track a specific kind of event in your application. Then fast forward 6 months, the product team and the development team working on a new feature, the developer goes in and they do some changes. And one of these changes in the code base, which is for a different kind of feature and so on, but by accident breaks a tracking event. It can just happen because like let's say there's some trigger involved and this trigger has been deactivated because someone in the development team thought, okay, it's not really necessary anymore because it was not used for the application. And she or he was not aware that it was used for the tracking. And so, because how should they? The more nasty things is when a trigger is changed, or let's say an implementation is changed, and now the event is fired too often. And maybe not even obvious too often, which would be like just 2 times, then you could see, okay, stuff has doubled. But let's say in 60% of the cases. So you see an increase of 60%, and you're not sure if is it increased usage or is it a technical problem. And so these are super hard to catch and to get this. And another, let's say, not so nice thing is like that values within, for example, event properties are changing. These are the things that can all go wrong. And the biggest problem in this kind of setup is, again, you cannot 100% solve the human problem. The biggest problem, what is happening here, is you have no control about this part here. The part where you send something to Mixpanel is totally out of hand. So it's handled by the SDK, it's sent off, and we all cross our fingers that whatever leaves the application with the SDK and arrives in Mixpanel is in the right shape. If the revenue is too high, the revenue is too high, and it's too high in Mixpanel. And the problem is like how all analytics tools are working is once the data is in the analytics tool, you cannot really change it anymore, or it's super hard to change it. So yes, you can hide stuff and so on. So this is all possible, but you cannot really fix things. And so this makes it problematic. The biggest problem, what we have today, at least like in my experience, is we have no control over this pipeline from the application to Mixpanel because like we use the SDK, send something off, and stuff can go wrong on this, what I just said. So it can be that, let's say, browser creates some problem. It can be a human problem. So we don't have instances in between that it's checking things. And this is usually the solution, every kind of data setup, that when we have a data quality problem, we are trying to increase the control over it. And increasing control means you introduce more tests along the way before we push something in front of the eyes of the business user. And this is the problem here, that we don't have this control. Let's talk about a different way. When we don't use an SDK, we are using the data warehouse. And so If you have followed me for a long time, this might be not a big surprise because this is the only thing which I'm talking about all the time, is maybe we are better off to do product analytics based on the data warehouse data. So let's extend this a little bit and let's introduce something in the middle, and this is our data warehouse. In a different scenario, we basically track the same things, but instead sending them directly into Mixpanel, we send them to the data warehouse first. Again, the same thing here can happen by using any kind of SDK. In theory, you could still use a Mixpanel SDK and then send the data into data warehouse, but this would be a lot of overhead. We can, for example, use something like Segment, RudderStack, or often like we have a lot of events already in the data warehouse, and so we don't even have to use SDKs. So, for example, we can use it directly from the database, or we can just load the data from different kind of places. So, for example, if you have watched other videos where I describe it, so for example, we can have Stripe data, and we load the data from Stripe directly in the data warehouse. It's not like that we have to get all the data at the point of time where it's happening from the application, which brings another data quality risk all the time. So if we conveniently load the data every night that has been collected by other kind of systems, we have a lot more control about this data. We load this in our data warehouse. And in the data warehouse, what we can do is we can do this thing that we did before already. We can create an event model. And by creating this kind of event model, we prepare the data before the data is then synced up into Mixpanel. And so the interesting part is happening here. We were talking about we don't have control. I'm very bold here to say we have full control. Of course, I guess full control is always an illusion, but we have a lot more control here because we can make a decision what kind of data we will sync up into Mixpanel. We even have the possibility when, for example, we use Mixpanel Mirror, which is a new product that Mixpanel has released, that when it syncs the data, it checks what has changed with the data in between. For example, when we discover in our data warehouse model, or when we discover in Mixpanel, that at some point we sent a wrong revenue. For example, I don't know, there was a mistake in the API, and so the revenue was 10% too high because, let's say, there was a different kind of calculation. We figure this out, and we can adapt this here in our data warehouse model. And then when we use the mirror sync, then this data will change when it comes into Mixpanel. This makes it extremely powerful. This is what I'm saying about. We get full control which kind of data gets in front of our users. And this is the most important point for me, is you, as the analyst or as the data team, you are in charge to control in which shape and in which quality the data arrives in front of your users. And this is one of the most important jobs that you have, because like when you nail this, when you make this really good, that you ensure a high quality, then you build up the trust. So you build up the foundation that people will work with the data because they know, okay, our data team has so many checks in there. So I can be sure if there's an issue, either I will get notified or I will see it, or the data doesn't even arrive at my end when it's not in the right kind of quality. This is the thing that a data warehouse enables us to do. When we have an event model, what we can do is like we can do the same thing. What every kind of data team is doing for BI systems is like we can introduce different kind of tests before things go out. This is what I will show you today, is like what kind of tests we can implement on the data warehouse level to ensure that the right kind of data goes into our kind of system. And I just show you a small snapshot of tests that you can do. So this is like the first thing that you can do in the first week. This can be extended significantly, and I will show in the end a little bit about it, what you can do. But let's maybe have a quick look how this really looks like with a real example so that you can get an idea, okay, what you can actually do with test and event data. But before we jump into this, quick recap. Why are we doing this? We introduce another step, and we introduce, okay, event data modeling. And I showed in the other videos that it has other benefit as well. So it gives us the possibility to enrich data in the data warehouse, that we can use other data that before we haven't sent into Mixpanel directly, because it would be a lot of effort to do this. This is the one thing that the data warehouse brings us for our analytics data. The new thing that I want to introduce today is it gives you more control about the data quality. Let's have a look into this, how it looks like. What we have here is an actual real project. This is the data project that I'm using for my own video platform where I host the different kind of courses that I create. And so I can show you how I implemented the different kind of tests to ensure that I send the right kind of data up to Mixpanel. This is a DBT project. If you use a different kind of approach, if you use SQL Mesh, you have all your queries running in an orchestrator, whatever, in the end, we are just writing SQL here. The only thing is like what DBT makes it easier for me is it gives me some shortcuts, or in the end, like macros and templates to implement specific kind of tests more easily. You can run this in every kind of setup that you do, since DBT in the end just creates SQL, so you can create it in any kind of system that you want. But if you use DBT, then it will be pretty straightforward for you to use it as well. We have a classic event data model here. Naturally, so we get a lot of different kind of data from different kind of sources, as you can see here. This, for example, is an interesting case where different kind of data comes from here. So just some data comes from an SDK. So for example, on the marketing website, we are using Pivot Pro. Then we are using Supabase for most of the application use cases. We use Tinybird to react on user interactions on the platform. And so this is where we get some data from. And then we have HighGraph, where we have all the metadata about the courses that we are hosting. We are integrating all this different kind of data in here. And from this data, we build our event model. I will not go into full detail how this model works. So I did other videos about this, so you can find them on my channel if you're more interested in how to build an event data model. So the important thing is where we looked in today is like, how can we run tests against this? And let's have a quick look. The obvious thing, this is really so obvious that it doesn't really stand out here. We want to look into how we can create different kind of tests. And the nice thing about DBT is we can use some standard tests, and these standard tests already help us a lot. For example, we run a unique test against an activity ID. Activity ID is the unique identifier that we create for each kind of event. And this, for example, prevents me when I create the model, and also prevents me if I check raw event stream data, I can check for duplicates. So I can create a key for the activity schema. So for example, in this case, I create a surrogate key based on the ID and based on the time that this user has been created. For example, if for some reasons in Supabase a record is created 2 times, then for example, I could already catch it here. So this is one step, but the other step is I do some modeling and some transformation here in between. I could easily screw this up. I could, for example, with the left join, basically duplicate entries, because I'm not really, I don't use the proper granularity, I don't use the proper join criterias, and so a lot of things can go wrong when you do some data modeling. And by using a unique test, I'm always make sure that in the end, like, I don't have duplicates in there. And so this is something you don't want to send duplicate events into your system. This can create a lot of problems. I could even take it a step further, but I could also like create an additional column which I don't really use later for analysis, but I just use for testing. So it could be, for example, that I can create something around the just created timestamp and maybe about the IP address that is also sent into Supabase. And so with that, I can make sure, because it can happen, for example, when it creates a unique ID, that Supabase just always increments an ID. So with that, we cannot really catch if there's a duplicate. But I can have specific kind of fields within my database that can tell me this is actually a duplicate entry. For example, I could check the email address here as well. So people use an email address, so I could go in there and I can just check, okay, do we have duplicate emails as well? I would not maybe do this here to use it as an activity ID, because this is an important ID for me to work further. But I could introduce I could, for example, use this here. So I already work with the email address here. So I hash it here because I don't want to expose it downstream as a plain text email, of course, so I hash it here. But I can use, for example, I could now go in here and take the email and use the email, or in the end, here we have it as the anonymous customer ID, and I can just quickly add another test and can say, this has to be unique as well. Because this in the end like enables me is, okay, we work from a paradigm that an email cannot create 2 accounts in our system, which we have. And so this is a good check that we can bring in here. And this is a check that is super hard for you to implement on the front-end side. If you want to implement this on the front-end side, you have to communicate back to your server, have to catch if someone actually is using an email address that is there. And then you just have to send your event away. You have a lot of things to incorporate. It's definitely possible to implement, but it takes more work. Here, in the end, it's just one line where we check everything. And we then can run the tests. So dbt test is just another command that we can run. And we can run these tests before we send the data up into Mixpanel, or before we generate the final table that then sends the data up into Mixpanel. And we can then create alerting that can alert us and we say, look, we just discovered we have some anonymous customer IDs here. We have to do something with that. And for example, we can then extend the model to basically catch this before. This is powerful and this is really good and this is really easy to implement. So the same thing, of course, like we don't want to send timestamps into Mixpanel, which are null. So this would create events that are totally useless for us because they just fall back on the default timestamp, and so we have data which is dated back on 1970, where, let's say, timestamp counting started. This is something we don't want to have. So we add a not null test in here because with this we can make sure we don't provide any kind of event that doesn't have a timestamp. This, of course, is something that will not happen on an SDK because the SDK always sets a timestamp. But again, if you do a lot more modeling and enriching, this is a useful test for us. One thing that you also have to, which can go wrong in an SDK, is like we want to have the right kind of, let's say, customer or user ID that stitches everything together. So we don't want to send an event into Mixpanel that doesn't have a user ID because this event is useless for us because we cannot use it. We cannot build funnels and so on with it. And so here, of course, like we do another check with not null. So this is already pretty powerful to establish a foundational data quality, but we can even take it a step further. One of the biggest problems when you work with event data in any kind of analytical tool is like how the events are named and how the properties are named. So first of all, it can be a design problem that you have too many events, so you come up with 150 events that you track. This is also a user experience problem, but we will not cover it here because like here we focus more on the technical problem. But one thing that can happen, and everyone who is watching this now and was working with tracking setups know this by heart, is like that one developer just names the event like this, and the second one, maybe 6 months later, wants to implement the same thing, but they name it slightly different. It can be simple things. So one thing, someone writes the event with an underscore, and the other one just leaves a blank space. Technically, it's pretty close, but for a system, these are two different kind of events. You cannot really work with this. If you want to work with this in Mixpanel, you had to merge these kind of events. And first of all, you have to recognize. So these are the things we don't really want. We want to have the events coming in with the right kind of event name. And so ideally, we can check and we can test before we do this. We can test it so that we can actually really see that. To establish this in dbt, I did the following thing. What I create is in dbt, I have the possibility to seed specific data into my data warehouse. And seed means it's like I provide a CSV file and dbt loads it into a table. What I can do is I can have a CSV with my event model. This is not a tracking plan, obviously, but I can take my tracking plan and I can just write all the different kind of event names that I have defined in my tracking plan. I can just add them here and have this as a baseline. This is a very minimalistic kind of setup, but it's already pretty powerful. So of course, like you can extend it to whatever you want. So you can create an automatic sync between your tracking plan and this, and you can auto-generate the CSV. So you can do a lot of crazy things in here, but you can just start very simple by just making sure that you check your tracking plan and you just add all the different kind of events names here. We seed here all the valid event names into our data warehouse. So this is step one. What we do in step two is like we have a test model. So this is not a test yet. It's like we prepare the data that we can then run finally a test against it. We take all the event data that in the end like we model together in our stream model. So the stream model is like all the events that we have together in one table. So we have one big table with all the events. So this is the table that we use. Also like to send the data into Mixpanel. So if you use one table per event, of course, like you can just create this here as a union statement to get all the data in. We get this as a baseline data because this is what we want to run the test against. What we do in the second step is we take our event model data that you just saw in our seed file, and we do a full join against this, and we compare the event name, or here I call it the activity name. So we compare this. And why do we do a full join? Because like we want to see if there are events in our tracked data or generated data in our event data that are not in our schema, because this is definitely an indicator for us that we have to do something. On the other hand, we might also want to see if we have defined events, but we cannot find them yet in the data yet, which can be a totally natural process that, because like we just have defined something, it has to be implemented, it has to be modeled. But it's always like a good cross-check for us to say, okay, how many events of the events that we have defined are we actually already tracking? We need these two sides, and this is like why we do a full join. I just added it here. These are in the end like the tests that we then implement in dbt. So dbt, I'm able to, in the end, just write normal SQL. And I can write a normal test, and this test should not return any kind of results. I'm testing for unknown events. Here I'm testing, okay, do I have an event name in my modeled and tracked data that I don't have defined in my tracking plan? So this is what we do here. So is null, and this fails when the count for this is higher than null. So of course, if we find one instance of that, the test fails. And so then I can run a dbt test, and this test can fail, and this can tell me like, look, we haven't defined this kind of event. So this is part number one. So test number two is like the other side. So I test, we have an event defined in our tracking plan, but we cannot find it in the data. This is something which I would not add to dbt as a failed test. So the problem in dbt is there is no warning stage. I would love to have this as a test that raises a warning to say, hey, we have some events here that you have defined, but we cannot find them in the data, which can be fine because they just have to be implemented. This is something that you can just run on your own, but I would not hook it up with dbt test, because then always like the test pipeline would fail. So this is more like you can test, or maybe you can even create a table based on that, and you can just check it in your dashboard to really see, okay, how many events have been defined but haven't been tracked yet. So this is something that I would just cover in an additional report or dashboard. I would not add it as a dbt test unless you always want to make sure, for example, for production tests, that you always have data also for all the events that you've created. So it might be a use case where it's useful. How does the data look like? And so this is what this kind of table generates. On the left side, we have all the data that we are tracking or modeling. And on the right side, we have, let's say, our ideal tracking plan. And for example, as you can see here, we have an event which is called video started, which we haven't defined yet. And so this, for example, if we run our test, this will raise an error. And this is good. So I want to have it erase an error because, yes, I want to have a video started event. I will add it to my tracking plan. But it could be it could be an opposite, like that I make a mistake. For example, like at some point I just write it in the wrong way. I just have a typo here and so on. I want to get this catch. This is great that we have it. And right now what we can see here is we haven't defined an event that we are not modeling or tracking yet. This is also good. We won't get a warning. This is the baseline table that we generate here, where we can then create this kind of test. So just let's have a final view on the test. Here you can see assert no unknown events. And this is the same test that you just saw on the model here, which we run here. And that's it. When I run now dbt test, here you can see this unknown event test fails because we have one unknown event. So this is exactly how it should be. And yeah, this is great. And as also we can see our unique test here also fails. So this is something where I have to check. So it looks like that I have duplicates in one of the tables. Now I can go in there and can try to check it, why we have these duplicates here. This is an extremely powerful way to ensure data quality before this data goes into Mixpanel. There's one upgrade to this, and I just want to quickly show you this. I will not go into full detail. Is of course, I could also check against the properties. Event name is nice to have this as well. So properties are a little bit more complicated because the properties can be modeled in totally different ways. So for example, when we send the data to Mixpanel, we usually put the properties into a JSON object. So we have it here. And so there's no straightforward way to use SQL and to check against a table that have all the property names in here to go in there. There are different ways to do this. I tested one way to try to do it with a Python model within dbt, but it didn't really work. And I really struggle with the Python implementation dbt because like it takes really like a long time, lets the model run significantly longer that I would love to run. So it's a bit complicated. So one thing that you can definitely do is, yes, you can run some tests in dbts, but since we do everything in the data warehouse, you can extend your test setup before you sync something up into Mixpanel in all different kind of ways. One way, like here you see this right now as a notebook, but I have the same kind of function in, for example, Google Cloud Run. So I just created a, let's say, a container instance that runs specific kind of tests for me in BigQuery, and then also can give me feedback on this if the test was successful or not. And so here I basically do the same thing. So I get the modeled event data, the final event data that I want to send to Mixpanel. I load this from BigQuery. Then I load my property model that I have also like in the CSV in there. And then I just run a test where I check if the property names are in the defined schema that I created. And as a second check, I even check the type. So I define for each property which kind of type they can have, if they have string or integer or a Boolean. I can check the type here against this as well. And then in the end, like I just return the results of this check. And I can either then raise an alert or I can write the results back again into BigQuery and then can have dbt do the final test if I want to hook it up like this. So right now I basically return this from a Cloud Run, and then I can analyze if there are some kind of error logs there, because right now I don't let the pipeline fail if there are some property issues, but I might do this in the future. As you can see, let's quickly come back here. With the data warehouse setup, I get the full toolbox that data engineers or analytics engineers are already using for classic BI setups to ensure data quality. If you're on a data team, you will already know what you can do. So if you're on a product team or you're a product analyst, you can talk to your data team, can say, look, when we go for this kind of way, what kind of things you can add to our setups to ensure the data quality? It's because we make the decision when the data is ready that it syncs up into Mixpanel. And this gives us a lot more control over the data quality. And this, in the end, we can ensure specific data quality to our Mixpanel users. And this sounds a little bit not so spectacular, but I can tell you over the long run, this is a spectacular change. Because I worked with so many setups with companies where we were analyzing data and we saw anomalies within the data, and everyone was like, yeah, we had a tracking problem here, but we cannot get it out of the system. So I always call it like the asterisk problem. So it's like where you show a chart to someone and you always put an asterisk there where you say, yeah, this was actually a tracking problem. So ignore this peak or ignore this drop. This is not real data. This was a tracking problem. You don't want to have this. So you don't want to present data to people with an asterisk explaining we had a technical problem here. With this setup, you enable this. If you run everything through a data warehouse, you unlock all the possibilities that data warehouse setups have to test data before you make it available to your users. I hope this video was useful for you. If you have any kind of questions, just add them to the comment. Make sure that you like the video if you like it, and also make sure that you subscribe to the channel if you're interested to learn more about how to work better in product analytics with better event data. See you in the next video.